I was halfway through drafting a vendor compliance report when Spencer Langford leaned against my office doorway like he owned the place. Technically, he didn't. Yet. But the way he smirked, hand tucked into the pocket of a custom-tailored suit he hadn't paid for, told me he thought his last name was enough to make the rules optional. "John," he said, like we were old friends, "starting next quarter, your division reports directly to me. I'm Jonathan Hale, Senior Director of International Operations at Northbridge International. I've spent 15 years building trade channels, negotiating with government agencies, and keeping the kind of client contracts that hold up under forensic audit. I'm 42, old enough to know how dangerous a rookie with a famous father can be, and too experienced to think I could just ignore him. The thing about nepotism is that it doesn't sneak in quietly. It arrives with champagne toasts, corner offices, and a round of press photos where the heir is positioned in the dead center. Spencer had been here all of 6 months, gaining real-world experience before his long-term leadership track. Translation: his father, Edward Langford, the CEO, was grooming him to run the company, and anyone in his way was a problem to solve. My team and I were in the way. We controlled the Asia-Pacific portfolio, which accounted for nearly a third of Northbridge's annual revenue. That meant we also controlled Contract Clause 14.2, the renewal safeguard every board member quietly prayed would never be tested. If a key client pulled their account due to executive instability, Clause 14.2 allowed them to terminate without penalty. Lose one anchor client, and you risk losing 3. Spencer didn't care. He had his sights set on restructuring us into something he could control, which in his mind meant cutting senior staff who weren't adaptable to his vision. I looked at him, careful to keep my voice even. "That's not how reporting lines are authorized." He grinned. "It will be." And that was the moment I knew, if I let him take one step without resistance, it would be over. Before I tell you what I did next, do me a favor, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. And hit like if you've ever watched someone get handed a job you bled years for. You'll see exactly why I couldn't just walk away. The irony was, Spencer wasn't even subtle. Within a week, he'd had my name removed from the vendor approval list. 2 of my senior managers were suddenly invited to apply for lateral roles in his newly minted strategic growth division. My calendar started showing meetings I hadn't been invited to. The telltale signs of a power play, all delivered with plausible deniability. I'd seen this kind of move once before early in my career. Back then, I didn't have the rank or the network to fight back. This time, I had both. I started small, quietly saving every email, every Slack message, every urgent memo Spencer sent. The ones where he overrode compliance sign-offs without legal review. The ones where he tried to reassign client accounts without contractual authority. By the end of the first month, I had a folder that would make any governance chair raise an eyebrow. The risk, of course, was timing. Push too soon, and I'd look like a bitter obstructionist. Wait too long, and Spencer would strip away the authority I needed to make my case. The sweet spot was somewhere in the middle, right when his ambition outran his competence. One morning, I walked into a finance sync and noticed something odd in the quarterly forecast. Slides a projected revenue bump that depended on a vendor contract we hadn't signed. When I asked about it, Spencer waved it off. "Details aren't your concern, John. Focus on execution." That line stayed with me all day. Not because it stung after years in corporate, you stop letting tone bother you, but because it was sloppy. Real operators know details are everything. And I had just spotted the loose thread. There was a moment sitting in my office that night when I almost convinced myself to let it slide. Keep my head down, ride it out, avoid the fight. But then, I thought about the team I'd spent 15 years building. People who'd flown across the world to negotiate deals in freezing warehouses and sweltering trade halls. People whose careers would be collateral damage in a trust fund kid's vanity project. I wasn't going to let that happen. And as luck would have it, the same week Spencer started making bigger promises, he couldn't keep a certain key client reached out to me with a concern that could make Clause 14.2 very, very relevant. Spencer Langford's first day at Northbridge International should have been routine. We'd onboarded plenty of VPs, most new to listen before talking. Spencer arrived with a vision board and a photographer. Edward Langford, our CEO, called, and all hands on the executive floor. No agenda. We filed in with coffee, and there was Spencer standing at the head of the table in a suit worth more than my first car. Edward smiled. "Meet our new Senior Vice President of Strategic Growth." No explanation. It was a title built to give Spencer visibility without accountability. I'd been at Northbridge 15 years. Real promotions involved vetting HR reviews, board approval. This was family theater in a business suit. Within a week, Spencer sent a company-wide memo suggesting we streamline compliance approvals to match growth velocity. Sophia Kim, our compliance lead, read that as cut corners until something breaks. She came to my office memo in hand. If he bypasses contract vetting, John, we're one signature from a breach. I'll handle it, I told her, meaning I'd watch him closely. The pattern emerged fast. Spencer thrived on big announcements, usually mid-meeting interruptions. He'd toss out goals like 20% revenue growth in 2 quarters without checking operations or demand. Then he'd vanish until the next spotlight. The turning point came during a leadership sync. Rachel Cohen, our key client contact for a major Asia-Pacific account, was explaining a shipment delay due to new port inspections. I was outlining a compliance workaround when Spencer cut in. Why don't we just reclassify the shipment category? Rachel blinked. That voids the contract and insurance coverage. Spencer shrugged. Then we update the contract language. To him, rewriting legal agreements was like changing a font. Marcus Dwyer, our legal counsel, didn't even hide his disbelief. Later, Marcus forwarded me a thread where Spencer told a junior contract manager to just make the changes without legal review. That's when I started my personal archive, every reckless instruction skipped process and risk he left behind. It's strange how quickly annoyance becomes method. I wasn't waiting for him to fail. I was preparing for the day the board would need proof. By month's end, my folder was a full audit trail. Slack messages, calendar invites sent, without me vendor proposals altered after approval, bad individually, damning together. Then late one Friday, an auto-forwarded email landed in my inbox. From Spencer addressed to Edward and 3 board members. Subject: transition plan. In it, he outlined how my division could be folded into strategic growth by Q3, with select senior staff reassigned to optimize agility. Select senior staff, me. Corporate war doesn't let you pick the battlefield. Sometimes it's a conference room, sometimes it's an inbox at 8:47 p.m. on a Friday. That's when my defense became offense. As I scanned the CC list, one name stood out: Rachel Cohen, which meant our biggest client now knew I was on Spencer's reassignment list. And if Rachel was reading that email, she might already be wondering what else was about to change. The question was, would she call me first, or the board? Rachel Cohen called me first thing Monday morning. Her tone wasn't warm. John, I read Spencer's email. Are you actually stepping back from the Asia-Pacific account? That was the opening I needed. Not voluntarily, I said. And if that account gets moved under strategic growth, you'll lose the direct compliance channel we built for you. I could hear her flipping through papers, contracts, maybe the same ones Spencer thought he could just update. Rachel wasn't sentimental. She was a professional whose revenue kept our board happy. If Edward and Spencer think they can change scope mid-contract without client consent, she let the sentence die. I reminded her of Section 14.3 Change of Management Impact Clause. Buried in the fine print, it required written client approval before leadership changes to any primary account. Rachel had negotiated it herself after a competitor once reassigned her contact mid-project. 14.3 isn't just ink, I said. It's leverage. By lunchtime, Sophia Kim was in my office. You tipped Rachel off, she asked. She didn't sound angry, just curious. Let's just say Rachel found a reason to review her contract. Sophia closed the door. John, if she formally cites 14.3, it triggers an internal compliance review. That's board level. Edward won't like it. That's the point. But this was corporate war. You don't fire the first shot without covering your flank. I needed more than Rachel's potential complaint. I needed a pattern of risk, something the board couldn't ignore, without risking their own liability. Marcus Dwyer sent me exactly that. 2 days later, a draft contract Spencer had pushed through with a vendor in Singapore. The file history showed edits from Spencer's account. After legal had signed off whole clauses, deleted risk allocations flipped. Marcus's note was short. He thinks track changes vanish if you export to PDF. They don't. It's funny, the moment I opened that file, the plan shifted from defense to offense. I wasn't just saving my role anymore. I was building a case that would make Spencer untouchable in the worst possible way, toxic to the board. The following week, Spencer tried another innovation. He scheduled a meeting with a logistics vendor without involving procurement or compliance. Sophia intercepted the invite and looped me in. If he signs anything in that room, we inherit the liability, she said. I went, sat quietly in the corner while Spencer pitched agility like it was a magic shield. Then the vendor rep asked about payment terms and Spencer promised a 60-day window we'd never approve. I didn't stop him, I just took notes. Every slip, every overreach documented. The difference now was that I wasn't alone. Sophia was feeding me compliance flags. Marcus was archiving legal edits. Rachel was holding her 14.3 card close but ready to play it. And still Spencer underestimated me. That Friday he dropped by my office with the easy arrogance of someone who thought the board already belonged to him. John, I hear you've been concerned about my methods. I leaned back. I'm concerned about the company's exposure. He smiled like that was a compliment. Relax. Growth takes risk. I let him walk out without another word, because in 2 weeks the board would see exactly what his risk looked like, black and white, date-stamped, undeniable. Before I tell you how I put that in front of them, think about this. If someone in your company was dismantling years of hard-won stability just to make themselves look good, would you warn them or let them keep digging? I chose the second option, and by the time Spencer realized what I'd done, it was already too late. Spencer had a gift for making his father believe he was the smartest man in any room, but that gift never extended to the people actually doing the work. Case in point, his latest streamlining initiative, which was basically a mass vendor reshuffle with no transition plan. He'd pitched it as a cost-saving measure. I knew it was a landmine factory. Northbridge's procurement system wasn't a spreadsheet you could rearrange over coffee, it was a live organism. Break one connection and you could lose an entire supply channel. I didn't warn him. I just made sure my own channels stayed airtight and my clients untouched. Rachel Cohen, my contact at our largest defense supplier, noticed right away. Your side's the only one hitting deadlines, she told me on a Wednesday call. What's going on over there? I just said we'd invested in risk mapping early. The truth was I'd been running dual sourcing plans for months, anticipating something like this. The fallout started quietly delays in niche component deliveries, a client escalation that landed on Sophia Kim's desk in compliance. By Friday, Marcus Dwyer looped me in on a thread with legal noting that certain vendor contract terminations violated our own policy clauses. That was Spencer's doing, and it was the kind of thing the board didn't forgive. I could have walked the evidence straight upstairs that afternoon. It would have been the clean hit. But I knew if I pulled the trigger now, the board might see it as opportunism. Instead, I wanted to pattern something that showed this wasn't one bad call, but a string of willful missteps. Over the next week, I let him twist. He announced new vendor deals and all-hands calls, presenting them like visionary pivots. I sat through those meetings, nodding just enough to look neutral. Every time I made a quiet note in my log contract ID, vendor name, policy clause violated. Sophia helped me match each one against the compliance archive. That's when the real gift arrived. Spencer, clearly panicking over the delays, tried to access the compliance archive himself, something only a handful of us had clearance for. The system flagged it instantly. Sophia sent me the audit log with a short message. Unauthorized access attempt, Langford S. Marcus didn't mince words when I showed him. John, this moves it from bad judgment to grounds for removal. I leaned back in my chair looking at the log on my screen. One click and I could set the fall in motion. But in corporate chess, you don't just checkmate, you pick the square your opponent dies on. And the square I had in mind for Spencer, he hadn't even stepped on it yet. I was back in the 11th floor conference room, the one with the glass wall that overlooked the river. Spencer Langford sat at the head of the table, acting like the chair had already molded to him. His father, Edward Langford, wasn't in the room, but the weight of his absence was obvious. Spencer was performing for someone who wasn't there. On my side of the table, I had Marcus Dwyer, my legal ally, and Sophia Kim from compliance. We weren't here for a social call. The conversation was about vendor renewals and the subtle way Spencer was trying to strip me from any decision-making authority. I think we can streamline by moving those approvals under my team, Spencer said, not even glancing at me. He'd dressed it up in corporate speak, but everyone in the room knew what it was, a power grab. Before I could respond, the door opened and Eleanor Grant walked in. Eleanor was Northbridge International's newest board member, an appointment that had raised eyebrows because she'd been recruited from outside the industry. She took a seat without a word, but her eyes tracked every expression like she was recording the room for evidence. Spencer's smirk faltered for half a second. He knew Eleanor's vote could tilt any upcoming decision. I slid a printed contract across the table. This is the current vendor agreement, I said. Page 7, the continuity clause. It explicitly states that project oversight cannot be transferred mid-cycle without mutual consent from both the client and the original project lead. Rachel Cohen, our key client contact, had insisted on that clause 2 years ago to prevent exactly this kind of move. I'd kept it in every renewal since. Spencer's jaw flexed. That's outdated. Then you should have brought an amendment, I replied evenly, but you didn't. Sophia chimed in, calm but cutting. And as compliance, I'd advise against bypassing a clause that the client is likely to enforce. That would trigger an audit trail. For the first time, Spencer looked less like a man on stage and more like someone doing the math in real time. Eleanor leaned forward. I'd like a copy of that clause, she said, her voice even but firm, and a brief history of its use here. That was the twist. Eleanor wasn't here as an observer. She was quietly gathering leverage. Whether it was for me against me or just for her own positioning on the board, I didn't yet know. But the fact that she'd singled out my document meant it would end up in the hands that mattered. After the meeting, Marcus and I rode the elevator down. You realize, he said, if she sides with you, this whole thing shifts. I'm not betting on sides, I said. I'm betting on paper. That's the thing about corporate warfare. Allies can vanish, but the contract stays. Still, a part of me wondered what Eleanor's endgame was. She hadn't built her career on sentiment, and Northbridge wasn't the kind of place you survived without one foot in the shadows. If you've ever been in a meeting where you can feel the conversation tilting, but you can't quite see where it's landing. You know, the mix of adrenaline and calculation. I walked out with that day. And I'm curious, have you ever had someone unexpected walk into a room and change the trajectory of your entire career? Drop your story in the comments. I read everyone. The next morning, I got an email from Rachel. She'd heard rumors from her own network someone inside Northbridge was hinting to vendors that leadership was restructuring my role. If that was Spencer's way of testing my defenses, he just handed me a signal flare. Now I knew the direction of attack. The question was whether Eleanor would see the value in stopping him, or find a way to use both of us to tighten her own influence. 3 days after that boardroom moment, Eleanor Grant invited me to coffee, not at the executive cafe inside Northbridge International, but at a quiet corner table in a hotel lobby across the street. The kind of neutral ground where conversations could disappear into background noise. She didn't waste time. Spencer thinks he's already won. That makes him dangerous. I studied her, trying to decide if she was playing messenger strategist or something in between. Dangerous to who? To everyone who doesn't fall in line, including you. I'd come prepared. My laptop was in my bag, and inside it was an email thread Sophia Kim had forwarded to me. It showed Spencer pushing a vendor consolidation plan to bypass my team entirely. Buried in the attachments was a draft of a revised master service agreement one that eliminated the continuity clause Rachel Cohen had fought for. I slid the laptop toward Eleanor. If that gets signed, every project lead becomes disposable. Her eyes skimmed the screen, but her reaction was hard to read. She finally said, "The board will care if I tell them to. The question is, why should I?" It was blunt and it stung, because the truth was Eleanor wasn't my ally. She was an investor protecting her own stake. I could almost hear Marcus Dwyer's voice in my head. They don't save you because you're right. They save you if you're useful. I leaned in. Because if this goes through, your shares get tied to contracts with zero stability clauses. Every client relationship becomes a coin toss. She didn't smile, but her posture shifted a slight lean forward the way someone does when they're listening for the angle they missed. Later that afternoon, I got a Slack ping from Sophia. "Check your inbox, you're going to want to see this." The attachment was a calendar screenshot. Spencer had scheduled a strategic alignment meeting for Friday invite list, him, Edward Langford, and 3 board members. My name was nowhere on it. Marcus called within minutes. "That's your window. We're not stopping the meeting, we're dropping something in it." We spent the next 48 hours crafting a compliance memo dressed up as a vendor audit summary. On the surface, it was routine, but buried in the second half was a breakdown of how removing continuity clauses could trigger early termination rights in 6 of our largest accounts. And in parentheses, the projected revenue loss, a number big enough to make even Edward Langford's blood run cold. Friday morning, I printed the memo on heavy stock paper. That small detail mattered. A thin sheet gets lost in a stack. A thick one demands to be noticed. I didn't crash their meeting. I didn't need to. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Rachel Cohen called Edward directly to confirm whether this was approved at board level yet. She knew the answer, and so did I, but it forced them to pause and read the memo I'd sent to all attendees 10 minutes earlier. By noon, Sophia messaged me, "He's pacing." She meant Edward. And if Edward was pacing, Spencer was squirming. If you've ever had to fight your battle from outside the room, where it's being decided, you know the strange mix of power and powerlessness it creates. I'd laid my move on the table, but whether it would land, that was in their hands now. Have you ever had to win without being in the room? I'd love to hear how you pulled it off. Share it in the comments. At 4:47 p.m., an email hit my inbox from Eleanor. No greeting, no sign-off. Just, "You might want to be in the office Monday at 8 a.m. sharp." It wasn't confirmation, but it was a signal. And in corporate chess, you learn to read signals the way soldiers read the wind. Monday wasn't going to be another meeting. Monday was going to be the day I found out whether I'd just saved my career or handed Spencer the knife to cut it loose. Spencer Langford walked into the 38th floor boardroom like he owned the place, his navy suit still too crisp, like it had been tailored for photo ops rather than work. Eleanor Grant was already seated at the far end, flipping through the binder I'd slipped her 2 nights before. She didn't look up, but I saw her eyebrow twitch my first sign she'd read every page. I took my seat near the middle, just far enough from Edward Langford to avoid small talk. Sophia Kim sat beside me, her laptop open to a compliance dashboard she'd customized overnight. Every document was time-stamped, every email cross-referenced. Across the table, Marcus Dwyer leaned back, that lawyer's calm on his face that said, "I'm holding the ace and you have no idea." Spencer started with his usual performance. "The vendor delays are isolated incidents," he said, gesturing to a slide with a vague bar chart. "We're on track for Q4, assuming no further disruptions." I watched Eleanor close the binder with deliberate slowness. "Spencer," she said, "can you explain why the supplier contract addendums weren't reviewed by compliance before your signature?" The room stilled. This was the opening Sophia had designed. She tapped a key and the wall screen flickered to a Slack thread, time-stamped with Spencer's initials, approving a shipment bypass that voided a warranty clause. Edward shifted in his chair. "Is this substantiated?" he asked. "That's what the audit trail shows," Sophia replied, her voice even. "The language in the contract was altered without secondary sign-off, which violates Section 14.2 of Northbridge policy and nullifies indemnity protections." Marcus slid a folder toward Eleanor. "And here's the outside counsel opinion confirming it. In plain English, if a single unit fails in the field, Northbridge eats the entire loss." For a moment, Spencer's mask slipped. "We needed that shipment on schedule." He shot back, his voice just sharp enough to carry across the table. Eleanor didn't blink. "Schedule is important. So is not exposing the company to 8 figures in liability." She turned to Edward. "This is exactly the type of corner cutting that forces shareholder intervention." I could feel the temperature in the room shift. Spencer's plan to frame me as the obstructionist was collapsing in real time. Still, I stayed quiet, letting the weight of the evidence speak. I'd learned that in corporate war, silence in the right moment could be louder than outrage. Spencer tried to pivot. "Jonathan's been undermining this project from the start." Eleanor cut him off with a wave. "Jonathan's documentation is the only reason we know the scope of this risk. Without it, the board would be blind." The words landed harder than I expected. For months, I'd been positioning every move for this moment. But hearing her say it in front of Edward felt like the first real validation I'd had in a long time. I glanced at Sophia, who kept her gaze on her screen, as if she'd known all along this would happen. Marcus gave the faintest nod. The meeting adjourned with Eleanor calling for a closed executive session. As people filed out, Rachel Cohen brushed past me, murmuring just loud enough for Spencer to hear smart play. In the elevator, I finally let myself exhale. We weren't at the end yet. Spencer was too well connected to go quietly, but the balance had shifted. Now the board wasn't just watching me, they were watching him. If you've ever had to sit across from someone who tried to dismantle your career, piece by piece, you know the satisfaction of seeing the first crack in their armor, and if you haven't, stick around. The next move would hit him, where his network couldn't shield him. Spencer's smirk that morning was the same one I'd seen on him in the break room the day he bragged about streamlining a dozen people out of their jobs. Only now, it was aimed directly at me. He didn't know that every document I needed was already in motion. I'd spent weeks aligning each step, starting with Sophia Kim's compliance review. She'd pulled the exact vendor payment schedule Spencer had been hiding. One look at the red-flagged invoices, and she'd simply said, "If the board asks me whether I signed off on these, my answer is no." That gave Marcus Dwyer the opening he needed. Marcus had been the quiet constant in procurement, the the one person who knew the exact dates when vendors were supposed to be paid down to the hour. I had him schedule routine payment verification calls with 3 of our largest subcontractors, calls that just happened to align with when their accounts showed overdue status. Meanwhile, Eleanor Grant moved in the background like a shadow. She didn't like me, she liked chaos less. Her messages to Edward Langford were perfectly measured, polite reminders that our contracts contained a performance integrity clause, which, if breached, allowed the board to pull control from the CEO and place it in interim hands. No accusations, just reminders. The beauty of it was that each step looked like normal business. No one could point to a smoking gun. Yet each piece, from Sophia's refusal to Marcus's vendor, calls to Eleanor's clause, reminders, was tightening the noose. I sent Rachel Cohen a simple 2-line email. Hold the payments on Project Delta until you hear directly from me. Contract clause 9.4 applies. She didn't reply, she didn't have to. Rachel played her part by omission. Every day she waited was another day. Spencer had to explain why a multi-million-dollar project was frozen. By the time Spencer tried to smooth it over with the subcontractors, the damage was already compounding. A late payment here triggered a delay there, and suddenly our top client was asking why deliverables weren't on track. I didn't hide from the tension. I leaned into it. When the board called an unscheduled meeting, I sat 2 seats away from Eleanor, not across from Spencer. I wanted him to feel me in his peripheral vision without the relief of direct eye contact. They went through the motions, first sales projections, Q3 targets, but the air was different. You could feel it in the way Edward Langford's hand tightened on his pen whenever Spencer spoke. You could hear it in the clipped tone of a question from Sophia that needed no real answer. I kept my face calm, my voice measured, adding small, precise comments only when they tied directly to compliance terms or board authority. I wanted the words to stick in their heads. Integrity clause, vendor breach, material, risk. Every move was about building weight, not for me to swing, but for the board to feel pressing down on them until they wanted to act themselves. That was the part Spencer never understood. Power isn't about who throws the first punch. It's about who controls the room when everyone's waiting for one. The boardroom was quiet, but not in the way that meant peace. This was the silence people keep when they've just realized the trap's been set, and their name might be on it. The next move wouldn't just break Spencer, it would make everyone at that table choose exactly how much they were willing to bleed for him. The first real crack showed when Edward Langford's tone shifted mid-meeting. He'd been leaning back in his chair, letting Spencer carry the pitch about delays being strategic realignments, until Sophia Kim slid a printed vendor ledger across the table. She didn't say a word, just tapped a single overdue invoice in red. Marcus Dwyer followed with a calm, almost bored voice. That particular vendor supplies a core component for the Delta build. Delay it 3 weeks and the warranty clock on their batch runs out, meaning we'd be liable for replacements. It was the kind of detail that made the room go still. The board didn't care about day-to-day politics, but they cared deeply about liability exposure. I watched Eleanor Grant shift in her seat, glancing toward Edward. She didn't need to speak her earlier. Clause reminders were already doing the work in his head. I added my part like it was an afterthought. Clause 9.4 allows us to suspend the executive in charge of operations if actions constitute material risk to deliverables. We'd need documented patterns, of course. I paused just long enough to let them connect the dots: Sophia's ledger, Marcus's liability risk, and the quiet fact that every delay tied back to Spencer. That's the thing about corporate revenge. You don't have to win the argument in the room. You just have to make sure that by the time the argument happens, the other side is already bleeding out. I could see Spencer trying to read me, wondering if I'd somehow orchestrated the timing. He wasn't wrong. Weeks earlier, I'd mapped each dependency A to B to C, so that the truth wouldn't land all at once, but in deliberate, unrelenting waves. The symbolic weight of my old leather-bound project log sat in my bag. Years of notes, sign-offs, and incident summaries were inside. Most people thought I kept it for nostalgia. The truth was simpler. It was an audit trail in paper form, immune to misplaced digital files. During a break, Eleanor caught me by the coffee station. "You're patient," she said quietly. Not a compliment, not a criticism, just an observation. "Patience," I replied, "is how you make sure the right people hang themselves instead of you." The second half of the meeting was the turning point. Edward began directing operational questions not to Spencer, but to Sophia Marcus, and occasionally to me. In corporate terms, that's an early vote of no confidence. In human terms, it's the slow process of someone becoming invisible in their own seat. By the time we reconvened for the vote on emergency oversight, the language was cold procedural. Interim authority risk mitigation, performance review. But every word was a nail. Spencer's smirk was gone. I didn't enjoy the moment the way I thought I would. Watching someone lose their footing isn't satisfying when you've seen the steps they chose that brought them there. It's clinical, necessary. Still, the first mini payoff landed exactly as planned. The board voted to transfer operational control to a 3-person committee, Eleanor, Sophia, and Edward, pending a compliance investigation. It wasn't removal, not yet. But in the corporate food chain, being sidelined in public view is sometimes worse than being fired outright. As we filed out, Spencer brushed past me, his voice low. "This isn't over." I didn't look at him when I answered. "No, it's just starting." What I really meant was my motive had never been to just push him out. The seat he occupied was less important to me than the lesson the rest of them needed to learn. And that lesson wasn't finished. The truth was, I'd been aiming higher than Spencer since the beginning. They thought removing him from operations was the endgame. They didn't realize he was only the opening move in a plan that would reach far beyond his chair. Spencer wasn't in his office the next morning. His nameplate was still there, but the blinds were drawn, the desk bare, except for a single company-issued laptop sitting dead center screen black. Eleanor didn't say a word. When I passed her desk, just tilted her coffee mug slightly, letting me catch the words printed on it, "Not my first rodeo." I took the hint. By mid-morning, Marcus Dwyer had called an emergency process review that included Edward Langford, Sophia Kim, and me. It was positioned as a compliance update, but the real purpose was in the email's fine print agenda. Item 3, contractual liability realignment. That was my work, buried just deep enough to avoid immediate panic, but high enough to hit before lunch. Marcus opened with the audit trail. 2 vendor contracts Spencer had fast-tracked, both tied to inflated onboarding costs and out-of-scope deliverables, were now flagged under Clause 14-2. In plain English, Spencer had greenlit payments without securing performance bonds. Eleanor slid the supporting exhibits across the table, her tone flat, as she noted the missing signatures. I didn't have to look to know my initials were absent. Edward leaned forward, voice calm, but clipped, asking Sophia to confirm the chain of approval policy for high-value vendor commitments. She recited it word for word: 2 executive-level signatories, or 1 board designee per procurement control policy, 7.1. Her eyes never left mine when she added, "Neither condition was met here." Spencer wasn't there to defend himself, which made the silence heavier. I let it stretch before I spoke. This isn't about a clerical miss. This is about risk exposure. Those vendors now have leverage because we gave them money without locking deliverables. That's the kind of decision that erodes shareholder trust. It wasn't anger in Edward's eyes, it was calculation. He knew the board would care more about liability than personality. That was the opening I'd been engineering for months. After the meeting, Eleanor caught up to me by the elevators. "You don't want his job, do you?" she asked. I shook my head. I never wanted his chair. I wanted the people in it to stop thinking they were untouchable. That night, I sent Marcus a packet, no cover letter, just a compressed folder named Legacy Exposure. Inside were vendor emails Spencer had forgotten to forward, each one escalating demands after receiving early payments. The timestamps alone would paint him as reckless. The final file was a redacted screenshot from the internal Slack archive, Spencer telling a vendor rep, "Don't worry about formal change orders, just send the invoice. I'll handle the paper later." 2 days later, Sophia looped me into a board prep call. The tone was different now. We weren't talking about vendor missteps anymore. We were discussing reputational risk contingency budgets and the optics of proactive leadership transitions. That was boardroom code for pushing someone out before the press caught wind. Eleanor slipped me a 1-page memo before the call. It wasn't hers, Marcus had drafted it, but she knew I'd appreciate the language. The key line read, "In light of recent control failures, we recommend immediate restructuring to restore external confidence." No names, but everyone knew who it meant. During the call, Edward framed it like a safeguard. It's about stabilizing the vendor pipeline and sending a message that controls matter more than individual agendas. I didn't need to speak. My fingerprints were all over the facts, but my voice was nowhere in the official record. That was the point. When the board voted to remove Spencer from operational authority pending review, I felt no rush of victory, just a clean, steady confirmation that the plan was moving exactly as designed. I'd never needed to see him humiliated in public. I needed him removed in a way that looked inevitable, almost procedural. That's how you make the change stick. After the vote, Sophia messaged me privately. "You're about 3 moves ahead of everyone else, aren't you?" I typed back always. Still, there was a part of me that knew this wasn't the end. Spencer was out of power, but Edward hadn't yet realized that the same paper trail I'd built for Spencer could be adapted to fit someone far more entrenched. That had always been the real endgame, not the golden boy, but the man who let him think the rules didn't apply. You can dismantle a pawn without ever touching it, but to end the game, you eventually have to go for the king. The boardroom at Northbridge International felt colder than usual, though the thermostat read the same as always. Maybe it was just the way Edward Langford's voice cut through the air, precise, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Across the table, Spencer's jaw was set in that same defiant line he'd been wearing for weeks, but I could see the twitch in his fingers every time a new exhibit hit the table. Marcus Dwyer had just finished walking the board through the payment hold order, a vendor freeze triggered by a breach of Clause 14.2.3 in the procurement policy. I'd spent 2 months setting the trap, a paper trail so clean it could have been used as a case study in corporate compliance training. Every invoice Spencer had pushed through without secondary verification was there, each one linked to inflated costs and non-compete violations. Sophia Kim, ever the diplomat, translated Marcus's clinical summary into something the rest of the board could digest. We're looking at a recurring overage of roughly $2.4 million annually. That's not a clerical error. That's systemic abuse. Her voice didn't rise, but the silence after was heavier than any shout. Eleanor was seated 2 chairs down from me, a soft smile playing at the corner of her mouth, as she slid the next document across the table. Exhibit G, the audit trail Spencer had accidentally authorized when he bypassed the ERP security prompts. He'd assumed the auto-logging system was disabled. He'd assumed wrong. My pen rolled slowly between my fingers as the conversation moved on, the room shifting its focus from what Spencer had done to what the company was obligated to do next. For a moment, I caught his eyes. The glare was gone, replaced by something closer to calculation. He knew the math was against him now. I'd built this sequence to be methodical. No knockout punch, just relentless pressure, each step tied to an unshakable piece of policy. The board couldn't ignore it without putting their own reputations on the line. Edward finally leaned forward, folding his hands. "Mr. Spencer, do you have any explanation for these findings?" Spencer opened his mouth, closed it, then shifted in his chair. These were strategic vendor alignments he didn't get to finish. Marcus cut him off with a rare flash of heat. "Call it what you want, but the numbers don't lie." I didn't need to speak. My work was already speaking for me louder than any rebuttal could. The irony wasn't lost on me. Spencer had tried to erase me from this company without lifting a finger. I was erasing him the same way. As the board prepared to enter executive session without Spencer present, Eleanor glanced at me, tapping her pen twice against the table, a small signal we'd agreed on weeks ago. It meant the final trigger was ready. They escorted Spencer out, and the sound of the door closing was sharper than it should have been. In that quiet, I felt a shift, not the rush of victory, not yet, but the gravity of inevitability. I thought back to the first time I'd seen him in Edward's office, leaning back like he'd been born to that chair. That image had driven me through late nights and careful planning. But now, as the board began voting on his removal from operational authority, I realized it wasn't about humiliating him in front of these people. It was about something else entirely, something I'd been circling without naming. I wanted control, not over him but over my own future, in a place that had made it clear loyalty meant nothing without leverage. This wasn't just about taking him down. It was about making sure I'd never be in that position again. The board's vote was unanimous. Spencer would retain his title for now, but with no budgetary authority, no vendor access, and mandatory compliance oversight on every decision. In corporate terms, he'd been turned into a figurehead. As we left the room, Eleanor handed me a slim folder, her handwriting on the cover. Phase 3, she murmured. Inside were the preliminary HR findings tied to Spencer's mentorship program, another thread I could pull if I chose to. I slid it into my briefcase without looking at it. There would be a right time for that. For now, I let myself enjoy the smallest of moments, the feel of the symbolic pen in my pocket, the one I'd kept since my first promotion here. It had always reminded me that advancement came from proving your worth. Now, I knew better, it came from proving you couldn't be removed. And Spencer. He still didn't know the final move was already in motion. If you've ever seen someone get stripped of their power one layer at a time, you know it's quieter than you expect. Have you ever been in the room when it happens? The reader leaves knowing there's still one final phase and a personal motive yet to fully unfold, making them feel they have to stay for the ending. The settlement landed on Eleanor's desk at 9:04 a.m., time-stamped and watermarked like it had been waiting for her specifically. It wasn't the largest payout the board had ever signed off on, but it was the first in years tied directly to negligent governance and executive misconduct, legal phrases that carried more weight than any dollar figure. Her signature appeared 32 minutes later, not out of compliance, out of survival. That's when I knew the chain was complete. Every email I'd timed, every clause I'd lined up, every vendor I'd nudged into freezing contracts, it all folded neatly into this moment. The ripple effect was immediate. The press didn't care about the payout. They cared about the internal audit report that mysteriously made its way to 3 business journalists and a regulatory contact who'd been chasing Eleanor's department for years. They ran the story before lunch. By the time the West Coast offices opened, shareholders were on the line demanding an emergency vote. It wasn't loud inside the building. That's the thing people forget. Real collapse is quiet. It's in the way HR starts meeting behind closed doors, the way executives stop making eye contact in hallways, the way someone like Eleanor, who'd once held every conversation like a stage performance, started carrying her bag into the restroom with her. The board fractured in under a week. 2 resignations, 1 medical leave, and a press release so careful it read like it had been written by 3 law firms in separate rooms. Compliance was suddenly on the offensive, firing off policy updates and training modules that looked like they'd been sitting in draft for years. The one thing they didn't do was try to contact me. They knew better. I didn't spend the payout. Not right away. That was never the point. My true goal had always been to force a permanent shift in how they operated, to make sure the next person who thought about cutting corners would remember the cost. Money fades, fear lingers. It cost me too. There's no pretending it didn't. People I'd worked alongside for years now keep their distance, not sure if I'm the kind of person you trust or the kind you avoid. Maybe both. The symbolic object, the contract folder I'd carried through every meeting in this war, was empty now. Still, I closed it one last time and slid it onto the top shelf. Ritual matters. It signals to your own mind that the work is finished. I think about the Slack thread sometimes, the one where Eleanor called my compliance notes overkill and suggested we move forward without delay. I remember the timestamp, the exact moment I realized she'd just signed her own downfall. And I wonder if she thinks about it too. Some days I feel the vindication. Other days I just feel the absence. Revenge doesn't replace what they took. It just makes sure they can't take more. And if you've been here this long, you already understand the truth. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is make sure they never get the chance to do it again. So, tell me, have you ever watched someone in power finally face the consequences they thought they'd outrun? I'd like to hear how it ended for you.